Hello friends. So what we're doing this week is we're taking a critical eye to the first two parts of the package deal that we find in Descartes. So you'll remember that these are that minds are disembodied and that human beings are fundamentally rational. Now, just a quick word before we get into some of the details here. Sorry, I just need to set up the camera there. And that is that the question about the relationship between minds and bodies and the relationship between reason and other parts of being a human being, these things are incredibly complicated and have sparked a lot of discussion in the philosophical community, for the past, give or take, like 2,000 years. So what we're getting this week is just a very, very small glimpse at some of the ideas that are out there. So if you're interested in this, please don't hesitate to drop me an email. I would be more than happy to provide some answers to your questions if you have any. Or if you want to look further into the idea of embodied or disembodied minds, or the relationship between mind and body and world, or the relationship between reason and emotion, or any of that sort of stuff, please just feel free to drop me an email, and I'll be more than happy to talk with you about it. Or you can spark up a discussion on the discussion boards. So what we're taking a look at today specifically is we're looking at critiques of Descartes' view of disembodied minds. So think back to the second and the sixth. I don't know why I need to do that, but I just did. The second and the sixth meditations. Right, so in the second meditation, we had Descartes' cogito argument. Right, so he knows he exists as a thinking thing. Consistent with that is that Descartes is nothing more than a machine, right? Nothing more than just a biological entity that happens to think. So at meditation 2, we have that Descartes is a thinking thing, but at meditation 6, we get that Descartes is a thinking thing that exists separately from his body. So when we critique the idea, or rather, excuse me, before we get to the critiquing part, when I say that minds are disembodied on Descartes' view, what I mean by that is that literally minds can exist separately from bodies. Right? So again, that's Descartes' claim about substance dualism. Right? That we have mental substance, we have physical substance, and that these are two distinct kinds of substances. So my body is as distinct from my mind as my body is from your body, right? Just as you and I are two different organisms, my body and my mind are two different kinds of things. So what we get today with our critique from Peter Strawson and Ryle is we get a way of thinking about minds that incorporates elements of having a body in on the ground level. So in other words, whereas Descartes says that we can conceive of minds independently of bodies, and that minds can in fact exist independently of bodies, what we find in Strawson and in Ryle is the claim, no you can't. And in fact, not just you can't do it, but minds are necessarily bodily involving. So here's a little bit of a thought experiment. If Descartes is right, we can imagine something like a soul scalpel. Right? So what is a soul scalpel? Well, a soul scalpel is a special sort of instrument by which we can disconnect your mind and your body, so that so the soul scalpel, wherever your mind and your body connect, wherever that happens to be, the soul scalpel can disconnect your mind and your body. Now, for Ryle and for Strawson, the idea of a soul scalpel is utterly ridiculous, right? That we can't even conceive of a tool that would disconnect a mind and a body, because mind and body aren't distinct kinds of things, right? They're not two different substances that just happen to interact, right? The relationship is a bit more complicated, but totally doable, which we're going to do now. So the first thing to get out is a tool in philosophy that's really, really useful. Right? It's the idea of conceptual dependence. So we say that one idea or one concept is dependent on another idea or another concept. So when we say that concept A depends on concept B, what we're saying is that you can't think of A's, or you couldn't have the idea of an A without also having the idea of a B. So here's an example. Trusty glass of water. So consider, let's go with something super simple, right? So consider just like a square, right? So a square has 4 sides and 4 corners, right? So if you have the idea of a square, right? If you have that concept of a square, then you also have to have concepts like corner and sides, right? And shape. Right? You can't, so in other words, if you don't know what a shape is, if you don't know what a corner is or a side, if you lack these concepts, then you're also going to lack the concept of a square, right? As soon as you have the idea of a square, with that comes the idea of corners, sides, and shapes, right? Here's another one, the concept of a dog, right? As soon as you have the concept of a dog, you also have the concept of an animal. That is to say, that you can't have ideas about dogs without also having ideas about animals. If you lack an idea of what it is to be an animal, you also lack an idea of what it is to be a dog, right? So the idea of a dog is conceptually dependent on the idea of an animal. So the idea of conceptual dependence, then, is that some of our concepts depend on others of our concepts, right? And that you can't have more complicated concepts unless you have the simpler constituent concepts. So how does that relate to mind and body? Well, for both Ryle and Strawson, but in kind of different ways, they say that a concept of mind depends on the concept of a body or of a person. So as soon as you can start thinking about minds, as soon as you can identify what has a mind and what doesn't, you already, or rather you couldn't have that concept without also having a concept of being a body or of being a person or human being. So in other words, as squares are to lines, minds are to bodies, right? Or actually, a bit more carefully than that. As the concept of a square is to the concept of a line, so is the concept of a mind to the concept of a body. So the reason, right, so just to highlight the difference between those two. The first time I said it, when I just said square to line, mind to body, that's making ontological claims, right? It's making a claim about what squares and lines and minds and bodies are. And right now, Ryle and Strawson are interested in concepts, right? Our ideas about these things. So it's a little bit of a weaker claim, but it's a more defensible claim. Anyway. So how does Ryle get at this? Well, Ryle gets at this by introducing this notion of a category mistake. So what is a category mistake? Well, we can give an example. In fact, Ryle gives a fabulous example in that chunk of the concept of mind that I asked you to read. It's the example with the university, right? So imagine that somebody asks you to show them around the Gonzaga campus. So what do? Well, you take them to different places, right? You take them to College Hall, you take them to the new Henningsen Center, you take them to the gym, you take them to the Bark, right? You show them all these different buildings, right? The library, right? And all these fantastic things. And of course, the philosophy department. And your friend says to you, thank you so much for showing me the library, the Bark, the philosophy department, the Henningsen Center, etc. But you didn't show me the university. So when our friend responds in this way, we are rightly puzzled, right? Because when you show your friend all of the buildings on the campus, you've shown your friend the university. That is to say, the university is constituted, or is made up by, all of the buildings and all of the people on campus. So as soon as you see all of the buildings and all of the people, you've seen all there is to see of Gonzaga, right? There's no university existing alongside all of these things. Now, that's not to say there's not a university. Of course there's a university, right? You're attending this university, right? Newspapers write about this university, right? You pay money to go to this university. The university is a thing, right? But it's not the same kind of thing as the buildings making up the university. Again, the university exists, but as an entity distinct from all of the buildings that make it up. So, when we mistake the university for being something alongside the buildings and the people, we are making a category mistake, right? We're mistaking an entity of one type to be an entity of a different type. So that is, we mistake universities to be things like buildings. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that universities aren't things. That doesn't mean that buildings aren't things, right? Of course, universities are things, buildings are things. But they aren't the same kind of thing, right? That's what's key to get down for Ryle, right? And that when we mistake universities for being things like buildings, we're making a category mistake. Sweet. So, how does this relate to mind and body? Here's how. To think of mind as Descartes does is to make the same category mistake that our friend made with the university. So, mind is to body, I'll go ahead and say it. Mind is to body as university is to buildings. So, it's not like minds exist separately or alongside our bodies, or they don't exist alongside our activities. Rather, once we've gone through the incredible diversity of human beings and human activities, we will have covered the diversity of mental states and what it is to have a mind. So here's an example, and this example actually comes from Strawson. Right, so I'm going to borrow the example from Strawson because I think it illustrates Ryle's point really nicely. But just sort of make that little textual note. Hello. So here's the example from Strawson. Strawson says, imagine writing a letter. Right? So we ask ourselves, what is it to write a letter? Well, obviously you need things like pens. You need things like paper, and you need things like hands, right? But not just any old hands, right? You can't just stack together a pen and a paper and some severed hands and expect a letter to be written, right? Clearly, the hands that'd be sort of weird. The hands have to be attached to a body, right? But again, not just any old body, right? If we took those severed hands and we sewed them onto like a monkey, clearly you wouldn't have a letter getting written. Right? You could perhaps imagine the monkey flailing about in such a way that it would eventually do something like put marks of maybe English on a piece of paper, but we wouldn't describe that as writing a letter. So what does it take to write a letter? Well, it takes a pen, it takes a paper, or some paper, and it also takes a living human being doing certain kinds of things. Right? So here are things that when I'm doing them, I'm not writing a letter. Taking a sip of water. Taking a nap. Giving a lecture on philosophy of mind and human nature. Cooking dinner. Digging a hole. Doing some gardening. Playing with toys. Fritzing around with my phone. When I'm doing these things, I'm not writing a letter, right? So what counts as writing a letter? Well, a wide array of things, but not an unlimitedly wide array, right? When I sit down, and when I hold my pen, and when I have the piece of paper arranged, sort of related to the pen in the right way, and when I make certain marks on paper that others can recognize and read as, as a language, right, as English. So you'll notice that the intelligent activity of writing a letter is manifested in the activity, in the bodily activity. It's not like I do a little bit of mental activity called writing a letter and then execute those processes in my body. Rather, the mental activity of writing the letter just is performing specific actions in specific ways. So, if you want to go back to the text for Ryle, his example of this is believing that the ice is thin. Sorry, that's in chapter 2, which you didn't read. But here's the example anyway. So Ryle says, how do we know if somebody, right, so imagine a whole bunch of people, they're at a pond, right, and they're sort of playing around, right, and there's a sheet of ice on top of the pond. How do we know that somebody believes that the ice is thin? Well, they themselves don't go onto the ice. When their children get too close to the ice, they say, no, come back, come back, come back. They look around nervously to see if anybody else is trying to get on the ice. They say to other people, be careful, the ice is thin. So what is it to think that the ice is thin? What is it to believe that the ice is thin? It's to engage in this wide array of behaviors, right? Nothing more, nothing less. So believing that the ice is thin is a matter of acting in specific ways, sort of having a specific body, a certain kind of a body, namely this kind of a body, a human body, doing those things in a specific way. Right, so you can prime your intuitions this way. If a chimp started screaming and its noise sounded a lot like, don't go on the ice because it's thin, I'm not sure we would think that the chimp believes that the ice is thin. We'd go, holy shit, that chimp is saying words. What's with that? Right? But if I'm near the ice, right, and I start shouting, I start screaming, the ice is thin, be careful, you're going to say, oh, Lassiter thinks the ice is thin, right? Or you could easily say to me that the ice is thin. So, to bring it all back, believing, or rather, sorry, don't use that word right now, thinking that my belief that the ice is thin is something that exists separately in a mind that can itself be on its own independently of my body is the wrong way to think about minds and beliefs and mental activity. To have a mind, on Ryle's account, and Strawson's we're going to see too, is to have a body of a certain sort doing specific kinds of things. And to think of mind and body as separate things is to make a category mistake. So, an important question here. Descartes, real smart guy, right? You guys remember the coordinate, right? The coordinate planes from geometry, right? Where you have the right, and you have the dots and the grids, and you do your math that way. Well, I'm sure you remember that's the Cartesian coordinate plane. That's Descartes, right? Descartes invented analytic geometry, right? So he's no slouch. He's a smart dude. So how did he make this mistake? Well, for Ryle, he said that, or so Ryle's explanation here is that Descartes misunderstood the logic of his own problem, right? Really smart guy, really heavily invested in the mechanistic understanding of the universe that was really coming into fruition in his day, right? The idea that nature is governed according to very rigid, deterministic mechanical laws. So what did Descartes do? Well, he made kind of an obvious inference. He wants to distinguish between intelligent behavior and unintelligent behavior, right? So intelligent behavior, writing a letter; unintelligent behavior, insects mating, right? Clearly unintelligent behavior, right? Let's go way down. So what's the difference between these things? Well, Descartes thought that the difference was in the causal origin of the behavior. The causal origin of the behavior. Intelligent behavior has its origins in an intelligent substance, namely the mental substance. Unintelligent behavior, or non-intelligent behavior, has its origins in non-intelligent or non-mental stuff, that is, the physical body. So Descartes thought that what distinguishes intelligent from non-intelligent behavior was simply where the causal origin of the behavior, right? The beginning of that sequence of events that brings about the behavior. Ryle says it's not about causal origins. It's not about how the behaviors start. It's rather about how we perform those behaviors. It's not that behavior. So the dividing line between intelligent and unintelligent behaviors for Ryle isn't what sets off the string of reactions, but rather how we do those things. Right? We can do things unintelligently, right? Like I can trip and fall, right, and not mean to, right, and just look like a great big jerk. But also, I can trip and fall on purpose, right? I can do it intentionally to try to get a laugh out of some people. So when I do it intentionally, I'm performing the activity in an intelligent way. When I do it unintentionally, I'm doing it in a non-intelligent way, right, where I just stumble over something in the sidewalk. So that's the start of our talk about Ryle and Strawson. And so I'm going to finish here with Ryle, and then in our next clip, we're going to talk about Strawson for a few minutes. So again, key points from Ryle. Ryle argues that our concept of mind depends on a concept of bodies doing things, and he gets there by saying that to hold the opposite of that, that is to say that a concept of mind is not conceptually dependent on a concept of mind. I got so emphatic there, lost the train of my thought. It happens. So to say that a concept of mind does not depend on a concept of body is to make a category mistake. It's assumed that, when you're listing things, existing in the room with me right now, you'd have things like bodies, you'd have a pen, right? You'd have like a physical body, you'd have a pen, you'd have a glass of water, you'd have a slip of paper, you'd also have a mind, right? But that's the category mistake, to assume that a mind is a thing that exists alongside of a body.